Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today is our second of 2 episodes that were recorded live and in person while the team was together last month for the California Natural Muscle Mayhem show. It features coaches Brian Miner and Brad Loomis, our registered dietitian Steve Taylor, and our team's injury reduction and management specialist Nick Licamelli, who just competed on stage the day before this recording. And this particular conversation is one of the most universally useful shows we've recorded for any athlete, so we're very excited to share it with you. We actually started this one with the intent of wanting to help you guys compare and contrast the differences between a recreational or gen pop athlete and a competitive athlete, but it actually ended up being what we called a recalibration episode, essentially full of checkpoints and scenarios to examine your own athletic career. This show is going to help you evaluate where you're at, weigh it against where you want your lifting in life to go, and how you can maximize that for whatever season you're in to achieve your goals in the most efficient way possible. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this particular episode, head on over to 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 211. Let's get into it. Here is Recalibration Throughout Your Athletic Career with Brian Miner, Brad Loomis, Steve Taylor, and Nick Licamelli.
3DMJers, welcome to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. I'm joined today by our specialist, Steve, dietitian, Dr. Nick Licamelli, my fellow head coach, Brian Miner. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the opposite ends of competition prep versus Gen Pop coaching, how they kind of intermingle. And I kind of want to start this out because general population folks sometimes tell us what they think we want to hear. They tell us, I'm serious about my goals. I want to track my macros. I want to learn how to track my macros and be meticulous with my programming and etc. And you can take your goals very serious and not really track a thing at all. And think more so in terms of the big picture. Don't think about the here and now, but think about 3, 4, 5 years from now. And that's kind of what I want to talk about with you guys today. What is it that you want your general population coaching doing, or your clients doing? What do you not want them doing? What do you want your competition guys and gals doing? And what do you not want them doing, etc.? Because me myself, I would like to have most people that are starting out with coaching kind of starting the shallow end of the pool. Let's just kind of think about getting our ducks in order. Let's think about protein. Let's think about very consistent ways of getting your training in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So so let me throw it to you, Brian, my fellow head coach. What's kind of the things that you want and don't want maybe necessarily from your general population folks?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the individual, but I think sometimes, especially like remote coaching online, it's almost harder in some ways. Like general population, it's like everyone sort of starts when they coach, starting with general population. But in many ways, the behavioral side of it, I think, is the hardest part to master, like as a coach, trying to refine that with somebody, especially in a remote capacity, because you're communicating with them. Like you don't see what their day-to-day, looks like necessarily. So I think that the biggest thing with general pop clientele is just making sure that the plan is in place to help kind of breed consistency. And for that person, if they go in with, like, sometimes that is a more refined approach than for another person, just depending on, their experience with tracking and things like that. So, but, like you said, like focusing on habits is sort of the shallow end of the pool. And I think bridging that gap and managing expectations, like having somebody that, maybe is getting into training, looking at a bodybuilder and thinking like, okay, eventually I want to do a show, like letting them buy in to the steps that it's going to take to get there, and understanding that there's, each phase has its purpose, and like jumping into a very detailed, highly specific approach is sometimes doing them a disservice. And so I think just with general population athletes, managing expectations, I think is probably the biggest thing.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because you talked about highly detailed approach, and Stephen, you and I were talking about this, I think yesterday. I think about several years ago, the disservice I did some of my clients, being the numbers oriented guy that I am, and I like to see and numbers of what is happening in your life, and I think to myself, I probably contributed to many an OCD person by making them do that kind of thing. And now I've kind of gone 180, and a lot of it, Steve, is kind of attributed to you, and kind of your kind of more getting along without tracking, and doing more habit based things, Yeah, when you, because you do a lot of remote coaching with General Pop, and knowing that I've kind of learned from you on how to relax a little bit, on my Gen Pop, what are things that, do you even quantify things, or you just kind of strictly focus on habit formation and habit changes?
I still, and I think before I touched on that, just something you said in your introduction that made me like think is, it's like you're saying, I don't know, it seems like I've been looking at it more, like most of the information that's out there is geared towards competitors, and it's geared towards like very detailed approaches. And so I think it's hard for somebody who doesn't want to compete to get like evidence-based recommendations that aren't coming from this circle, because it's like the only people, like the top people in this field are putting out information for bodybuilders. And so it's like, I think we as like physique competitors will like pass information on to other people who are not competitors, because that's what we have. But then they're getting information that are for competitors, because it's like the only information that's out there that's like evidence-based. So I see why it's like that happens, is like there's not a lot of like information out there that's for strictly like, Gen Pop or non-competitors. But back to your like original question, I do have people quantify stuff, so it's tough, because I feel like the quantifying stuff is important, and I also think that, like, I don't know, because I've tried it so many different ways, and it, like Brian says, like, it's definitely individual, but like it seems like if I don't quantify anything ever, people will gravitate towards what they think they should be doing based on their past experience. And so they'll get super restrictive. And so it's like, it's not even that I want to give people numbers, but it's like, if I don't give them numbers, then they're going to go off of like what MyFitnessPal says, or off of some diet they did 10 years ago, because that's the only experience they have. So it's like, in some ways I'm forced to give numbers so they don't get too restrictive. But like, whenever I give numbers, and I think that's why like pretty early on I shifted from like giving people macros to just like calories, protein, fruits, and vegetables. Like I wanted everyone away from macros. Like I found that out within the first year of like really coaching. But yeah, so it's like I do give numbers, but I do focus heavily on the habits. So I don't know if I answered your question or.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah. You're thinking more so. Habits is the bottom of the pyramid, and then the macros kind of that'll be the next level once you get the habits kind of established, if I'm interpreting you correctly.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. So like a lot of times, like when we get going, like I might have them create like a flexible eating routine. And so I'll go back, hey, like what times, like when do you like to eat during the day? And they'll kind of tell me when they like to eat during the day. And I'll help them, I'll be, okay, like breakfast, have a fruit, lunch, have a fruit and a vegetable, dinner, have 2 vegetables, and then try to get like 30 or 40 grams of protein with each meal. Mm-hmm. So like that might be how I start giving them something to quantify, some structure without being like too detailed. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like that kind of what I
And
was.
then maybe later on have them track that food once they get those habits based, and then you can kind of start thinking more in terms of how many calories they're actually getting in and how that's affecting their body weight. Or
Yep.
do you even think about that at that point?
That's where it depends on the person. It's like typically the first two, I almost always have somebody start tracking at the beginning without any targets, just because like that's making them be aware of like their habits. And then whether I give them targets or not depends on whether they're actually making progress towards their goals and how they're going about things. So it's like if they're tracking and they're still like not being super restrictive and the scale is going down and it's going well, then I'll just not give targets right away. But like if 2 weeks in, I notice that they're eating like 1,200 calories and doing like long periods of fasting, and like I can tell they're being super restrictive, that's when I'll say, okay, I'll give a calorie target because I notice we're being too restrictive.
Okay. All right.
What do you guys find is more common? Do you find that people come to you with too much nuance and detail, and you have to kind of pull them back? Like this information, like you said, a lot of the information is for physique competitors, and it may be a bit too nuanced and detailed for a general population. But do you find that people come in with too much information or too little information? Like, do people come in just expecting to eat a serving of vegetables and lose 30 pounds? Or do you find people coming in saying, with the mindset of weight loss is so hard and there's so many different diets, do I fast? Do I do keto? Do I do paleo? Like, do you find that people are lost in the weeds when you see them? Or is it more they don't even know the weeds exist and they're just like, it should be easy, I'll just swap out, food group and whatnot? So which end of the spectrum do you guys usually see?
I need to kind of think about that a little bit, because I'm visualizing applications, as they come in. And I want to say, for the most part, people are aware of like their calories, because a lot of times that we have on the application describe, your nutrition to us. And they usually will have either some macro breakdowns or, some calories or something like that. So I want to say that at least the majority of the applications that I see there, people are at least aware of how many calories they're taking in, or at least they're quantifying their food in some way, shape, or form. Would you agree with that? Because you see all of our applications for the Skypes for the most part.
A large majority are either tracking at the moment or have tracked before.
Yeah. I think where they get lost in the weeds is that they look too closely at the short term. And so they see themselves, okay, on these calories, I gain weight for 3 days, and they don't look at the big picture, and they really don't know how their bodies respond to the calories that they put in, and so they assume that 2,200 calories is a surplus because they gained weight over 3 days, and they quit at that point. They quit tracking because they're gaining weight, and it's a surplus, and I think that's what I see a lot of times, is that people are too focused on the short term instead of looking at the flow of 6-8 weeks, if that makes sense. How about you, Brian? Because you're kind of new to us, and you probably had your system. What kind of do you see on your end?
Yeah, same thing. Like you'll see people that are, listing their meal plans that they're eating each day. You'll have other people that says mostly clean foods. It's like, okay, well, there's a wide spectrum there, but you brought up a good point. Like, a lot of people, like, it goes back to like the consistency thing. Like, if people aren't giving themselves, or understand that they need to give themselves more time to see numbers kind of shake out, like, if they're gaining weight after 3 days at a certain intake and they throw in the towel, or they think their initial thought is like, okay, well, do I need a different macro breakdown, and so then they start focusing on details that are, skipping the foundational, elements of this, and, the consistency aspect. And I think part of, as a coach, especially with Gen Pop people, is getting them, like educating them, like this is what to expect. Like your weight is going to fluctuate significantly day to day, or can, and we need to find a plan that's sustainable. So one, we can give ourselves enough time to gather some data so we actually know if what we're doing is working. And but I think to go back to your question, Nick, I think if more than, I would lean on people focusing more on, I guess, details, like they're like the macro breakdown. It's like, okay, well, like, should I switch carbs and fats here? I understand calories and protein are, kind of the two primary, factors for importance, but they haven't strung together a week of consistency, and so it's focusing on details. They're trying to run before they can walk, and the details that truthfully don't have a large impact in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, it's anybody who's following like a fad diet or, something that's focusing on eliminating a specific food group or macro, they're kind of ignoring just the principles of energy balance to begin with. And so that focusing on, finer details, that they're skipping a number of steps, I guess. I find a lot of people skipping steps when they apply.
Which is tough, right? Because it goes back to like the content thing. Like most of the content that's out there is like
trash.
It's like clickbaity stuff. So it's like avoid this food or like do this thing, or it's
these 3 things will get you the results that you're after.
Yeah. So it's like if that's the only stuff that's out there and you want to lose weight, like you're just gonna be trying stuff. Like, there's just, unless you find your way into like this little niche, like it's
So I've kind of been sitting here planning my what I'm going to say next, because it's funny, this entire conversation is the same exact thing that I deal with in physical therapy. Every single thing is exactly the same that we're talking about. It could be thrown into PT. And I think we have an interesting sample of people that may reach out to us. They probably know what a calorie is, what protein is important, things like that. And same with me. I think people that are into their bodies and like working out, they've probably Googled lower back pain before, or like shoulder pain. They probably know what a rotator cuff is, or at least where it is, as opposed to someone who maybe I treat in like my brick and mortar clinic, who's just like an average Joe. Maybe they don't know anything about their bodies. But this conversation is one that I often kind of think about a lot, because I think sometimes when it comes to pain, people just come in with these with too much knowledge, I think, and they come in and they self-diagnose themselves. They say my L4 is herniated and my multifidus is weak on this side, or I need to do these special exercises, and it's more me listening to that person saying, okay, like totally understand like what you're saying, I hear you. But I think before we go there, so I don't want to say like we're not going to do those things that you're doing and you're wrong, but I say keep those things on the side for now. Let's talk about habits. Let's talk about adherence. Let's talk about step count. Let's talk about sleep, things like that. And then once we get those kind of habits, like we were talking about with the nutrition and coaching, then we can build on that. And like Steve, you were saying, you kind of just say, okay, let's add in like meal 1, throw a vegetable. Meal 2, let's do vegetable and fruit. And then as you build upon those foundations, then maybe you start counting calories or break it up into macros. And that's the same process I go through, right? Just kind of start with the basics, start with some education about pain, start with, like I said, if it's someone with low back pain, step count, and just these basic life habits, just to kind of start on square one and then kind of build up from that. But this whole conversation is exactly the same principles as pain and rehab.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to me because, there's a number of fields, or most fields, we're not on an individual basis going to be experts in. And so it's almost like just being a coach has sort of helped me gain some self-awareness of when I'm like the applicant in some other field. Like how these are, am I asking stupid questions, you know? And so, and I think oftentimes that's the case. It's like, okay, like you realize that you're going in with these preconceived notions of what you should be asking. And, you know, I have to remind myself, you know, if someone, you know, I would imagine some of your clients, they come in and they ask for something specific, or, you know, they self-diagnose, and then you start talking about step count. They're probably like, okay, like I'm not that big of a beginner. But it's like, no, you aren't. Like you have the knowledge, but you're focusing on details that matter, but not like, are you checking these boxes first? And I think that applies with any, you know, area of research, or, you know, any industry specifically, is there's a lot that like, I just side tangent here, but, you know, like nutrition documentaries on Netflix, you know, they're easily, you know, they easily persuade people and, you know, instill these biases for people because they're considered a source of reputable information that, you know, a lot of people view them as, you know, this is, you know, they had a doctor speaking on it, so it's gotta be true. But then, like, I'll watch a documentary on something else, and I'm just like, have this jaded outlook, like they're bullshitting me. so like, I don't know, it's like that happy medium there, but it can be difficult.
Yeah, I like what you guys are talking about, because it's like on the new, like you're talking about people will come in and self-diagnose. Like it's the same with like the nutrition side of stuff. Yeah. Like I think I have a dairy allergy, or I'm allergic to gluten, or but like you said, just kind of, and then like when I cut that stuff out, like I feel much better, but like maybe the only time they have gluten is in very large quantities, and so it's not the gluten, but it's like they had the whole pizza. So it's like, but it's hard because then there's like 50 articles that say like no one can have gluten, and like I guess it's just yeah. So
hey 3DMJers, Andrew Valdez here to tell you about our new course in the 3DMJ Vault, the Advanced Deload Guide. This one was made by one of the men you're listening to right now, Brad Loomis, and he'll be showing you exactly how he does standard deloads, staggered deloads, built-in deloads, workout skipping deloads, and a whole lot more. It's a short and sweet delivery of 5 videos with Brad walking you through the exact spreadsheet blueprints he uses for his athletes, and why these deloads without the deload have been so helpful for keeping his athletes' performance and motivation high all throughout their training year. This is our 16th video course in the 3DMJ Vault, and you can become a VIP member to get access to every single one of those courses for just $12.99 per month or $69.99 per year. VIP members will get this advanced deload guide, the calculating your calories course, the lifting library, our contest prep Q&A collection, the sustainable fat loss course, the lagging body parts course, and many, many more. Go to 3dmjvault.com and sign yourself up today. That's 3dmjvault.com to get all access. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the show.
When people come in with those kind of like self-diagnoses, it's so difficult to kind of have those conversations because they just feel so strongly about it. And when it comes to coaching and nutrition, people are going to have relatives or anecdotes that have had success with different things. So, my sister eliminated gluten and she lost 30 pounds. So then that's what they think they have to do. And just like pain, you know, they'll say, my cousin had back pain just like this, and they went to someone and they did an adjustment, or they did some cupping, or they did some scraping, and they felt great after 3 visits. And, you know, that's what I need. And things are just a bit more nuanced than that sometimes. So it's difficult when people come in with those expectations, because obviously something like pain, similar to Brad, where you were talking about before, how sometimes we find ourselves, or our clients kind of find themselves so focused on the short term. And my weight jumped up a few pounds in 3 days, or I dropped a pound in 3 days, so I must be on the right track. When it comes to pain can be impacted by so many things in the short term. You can watch a romantic comedy and have less knee pain after that. So it's challenging when, because that makes it, that solidifies things when pain gets relieved, or when that pound gets dropped on the scale in a day. it kind of like
reinforces bias.
exactly, it reinforces the bias. So yeah, I find that that sometimes with pain as well, being focused on the short term rather than the long term, and also the preconceived notions coming in from family, friends, past experiences. I think that's difficult to navigate because you don't want to say that they're wrong, because they may not be wrong. Like, that may be some truth to that. Like, maybe if their sister had success with gluten, maybe they have a gluten thing. Like, or maybe if someone had success with a certain type of pain treatment, maybe that buy-in, because the hard work is done, they already buy into the treatment. Maybe that will make that treatment the best option because they're already halfway there. Like, we're already rolling, just keep going with it. And I'll throw in some graded exposure and some strengthening. But if going to your practitioner who does cupping twice a week, but then you also come to me for some strengthening, if that's what's going to make you feel better, let's do it. Like, cupping all the way. But as long as we kind of have our principles mixed in there, that's what I found is kind of the best way to navigate those things. But it's difficult sometimes, and it depends on the individual, as you guys know.
Well, and it's even myself, it's so hard to look at the big picture, because I'm good at doing it with our clients. I'm good at saying, okay, well, you know what, you experienced this to this day, but I'm seeing here 4 or 5 days earlier that this happened, and this happened. And it's not like an on-off switch where now that is the result. It's it takes time. And I experienced that. I'm like, okay, well, the other day, I did my pull downs before my bench press and my shoulder felt better. So therefore it's the pull downs that made my bench press feel better because it's in the short term, right? And that's always the challenge, is it's like, how are we able to get not only our clients, but then also me? How do I take into consideration this happened a week or two ago, and now I'm kind of seeing the fruits of that labor, or like kind of like compound interest in a way with like certain stretches or certain movements that you do. It's like you're not going to get relief right off the bat, and just because you didn't get it doesn't mean it's not working. You got to give it time to compound. And the reason I bring this around now to training, because I was just Brian and I, you were just talking on, and I were just talking on the way down. I have this new thing that I want to do to train my lats, but I have a certain amount of resistance to it because it's a little bit inefficient. I got to train one arm and then I got to train the other arm, and I hate doing that. I'd be more efficient. I just train both arms at the same time. And I got to keep in my mind, I got to keep thinking, okay, you got to listen to your own advice and look at the big picture and look at things down the road. Don't think of it even in terms of like a few months, like maybe the end of this year, the beginning of next year, but you've got to get that in to the system and in the habits right now. I'm reading this book, Atomic Habits, right now, which is, phenomenal. But it's kind of like I'm thinking to myself, how can I get my clients to look at the big picture and understand that what they're doing now may not reap benefits until a month, 2 months, 3 months, a year down the road? How do we get them to understand that what is happening today is not a result of what happened yesterday or the day before, but it's what you started doing or didn't do or quit doing, a month ago, and things like that. And it's we've talked about, okay, these are the habits that we need to get going to make the change that it is that we're after, and so it's kind of like, now I want to think to myself, okay, we get these competitors that come to us. You just got done doing a bodybuilding show. We get people that come to us wanting to do bodybuilding competitions, powerlifting meets, etc. They've got certain habits in place, and now we got to start thinking of the meticulous stuff, right? And the reason I bring this up now is because we do think big picture, and we think the ebb and flow of life, and how we don't want sometimes competitors tracking their macros. We don't want them thinking about the proper sets per week or per microcycle, and things like that. We just want them to get the habits in there. But now it's time to start thinking of the nitty gritty and thinking of the meticulous and getting a little bit more OCD, And because we do want balance, people will sometimes get this rose-colored glasses look to us. Oh, well, I'm going to be able to get shredded, and I'm going to be able to get a 1,300-pound total, kind of doing these loose habits that you tout so much. I can kind of do intuitive eating and focus on my fullness levels to get shredded. And to me, that's frustrating when we have to find that nice transition. But it's like, okay, now it's time to get dirty. So, you just got off the bodybuilding competition. At some point, you had to make that little bit of shift. Now, it doesn't have to be an on-off switch. It's not like, oh, well, now the switch is on. I'm competition mode, and it's everything to the point.
That's exactly what happened. Exactly.
But I'm sure you had to make that transition, at some point.
Yeah. I think what I like what you said, Brad, about the habits and how it's on a spectrum almost. And I think one of the things that I always have to remember is who are we dealing with? Because back to kind of the gen pop versus the competitor, it's a whole different animal. And I think as a coach or as a practitioner, Leo, if he's listening, he'll like this. Be like water. We have to, for those who get that joke, we have to be like water sometimes, and we have to maintain our principles and our habits and the things that we want to instill, just like we've talked about up until now. But at the same time, someone coming to me with back pain who's a high-level pro bodybuilder, they've tried modifying range of motion, they've tried modifying load, they've tried basic stretching that they found, and they're still having pain. That person is a whole different animal than someone who just comes in elderly with back pain. And I have to make sure that I don't make that elderly person a competitive bodybuilder in my mind. Maybe they don't need to, maybe squatting and lifting from the floor isn't always a solution for someone, even though I think that's probably true. I always have to check my biases and see maybe that's not the case. So I think for all of us, when we're kind of ebbing and flowing from the gen pop to the competitor, sometimes it's difficult to do that. Sometimes it's difficult to, I don't think it's watering down water. I don't think it's watering down our skill. I think it's just shifting. And that is sometimes hard. And early in my career, I found that difficult to do with competitors, because right out of school with not much experience, you're kind of good at treating that gen pop. You're good at doing the basics. But then when you get that pro bodybuilder who tells you all the things that they've tried and they're still having pain, you're kind of like stuck. You don't really know what to do. But as I get more experience working with that population, now sometimes I find the opposite. Sometimes it's harder to work with that general population patient as opposed to the competitive bodybuilder, because that bodybuilder, they speak our language. We could start at step 5, and we don't have to, if they say that if I say the words hip hinge, I could be confident that they know how to hip hinge, because I've watched them on Instagram and they can hip hinge with a lot of weight. So I know if I ask them to hip hinge at home with a broomstick, they're going to know what to do. Different than someone who isn't in that world. So it's funny how as my career has gone on, I've had difficulty kind of making that shift side to side. Not sure if I know we mentioned that originally, usually coaches and trainers start with gen pop and then kind of get into this niche area of bodybuilders, but have you guys found that as well?
I don't, well, in this specific, I guess, like online coaching sector of things, I don't know if that's it. I think the opposite can be true now too for a lot of people. Not that that's a good thing. I think that's a bad thing, but I think you see a lot of people that are competitors themselves that, follow evidence-based principles. They're interested in the research, and they certainly have good intentions, but then they want to start coaching and educating others. And then they get somebody who's gen pop, and it's hard to make that conversion. They're speaking a language that they don't understand. And so I have noticed that it's one of the unique professions where it's like you can sort of start Like there's no barrier for entry, you know. It's like you don't need to go to school to become an online coach. So I think what separates, like, you know, really good coaches is the ability to be able to shift, like you said, across both sides and communicate and teach those, like, have those soft skills that are going to allow you to, you know, instill these habits in these people. Because I mean, that's not something you really learn in that you have experience with unless you seek it out intentionally. So, but yeah, it's interesting because it is one of those things where I see people start and it's like they do a show and then they want to be a coach, you know, or, and so it's almost the nature of it allows people to skip some steps, and that's unfortunate in some regards.
Quick story. So 3 of us have children. Steve doesn't have any children that he's aware of. So about how we have to, we can't treat our the people that come to us for help all the same. We have to kind of shift, right? Like we're saying. So my daughter is almost 3 years old, and something happened. I don't know if I don't know what exactly happened, but I remember. She said something when she was upset, and it wasn't very nice. And in the moment, I didn't like reprimand her. I didn't say anything. I just said basically like, you know, it wasn't very nice. And then we kind of moved on from it. And then later, when she was calmed down, I sat her down and I said, okay, now this is going to be good. I'm going to get to her. I'm going to talk to her. So all my skills that I know about communication, I sat her down and I said, Ava, I said, do you remember before when mommy was trying to brush your hair and you put your hand up real fast and said, no? She said, yeah. I said, I know you didn't like your hair getting brushed because brush gets stuck sometimes. And she says, yeah. So I said, but sometimes when we get really mad like that, it's okay to get mad, but we can't raise our voice and we can't throw our hand up. I said, it's okay to get mad. Daddy gets mad sometimes. Mommy gets mad sometimes, but we can't be mean and we can't yell at people that we love. I said, do you understand that? And she looked at me and she goes, boop. She goes, you have a nose, Daddy. So that is an example of me not adapting to my audience. Because I was not speaking her language. I thought I was, and the whole time I was like, this is awesome. She's gonna look at me and say, Daddy, I get it, I feel you, and we're gonna have this lasting relationship all the way into her teens. She's never gonna date anyone. She's gonna tell me everything. But yeah, so that was just a story I thought of having this conversation about how we have to see everyone as they come to us, and we can't always put them in these cookie cutter competitor gen pop. We have to make sure that we kind of meet them where they're at.
Yeah, and it's funny because now it's kind of like I almost have like a little bit of clarity on our conversation. You know, it's kind of like, because it's kind of a two-way street. You know, it's like we've got, like you were saying, we've got coaches who are competitors who now have to kind of speak this new language and get almost themselves to learn how to be effective coaches to general population people, when sure, you're going to get results tracking macros and hitting these numbers that I'm going to give you. But, you know, it's like learning a new language in a way. And then likewise, you know, we've got people that want to be competitors. They've never done it before, you know, and we tout all of this balance and using intuitive habits and et cetera. But you're going to have to start plopping your food on the scale, you know, and you're going to need to start tracking your macros, you know. And so we've got this. Luckily, we're of the experience with enough people that we can kind of we can balance that, you know. I mean, but it's still super difficult, you know. And then we have those kind of those people that are in the middle. They've done both, you know, and then they've got resistance, you know, like they might be a seasoned competitor and they've gotten shredded and they've been meticulous and now they don't want to. They would rather just get the same result, you know, without having to do all that, you know. Or you've got the opposite where you've got, okay, you know, now I'm in my recovery season, and I want to keep tracking my macros. I want to be on point and be meticulous, and it's not sustainable, you know. And so finding that transition, it's like, how do we game the system here? Or not how to game the system, but how do we make that water flow better? You know what I mean? Because a lot of times it's just a matter of letting, at least in my opinion, and I want you guys to chime in too, but a lot of times it's just a matter of like being there for support, offering advice, but then you have to kind of let them live the way they want to live and learn from the mistake. It's like, okay, well, you know what? Go ahead, track your macros, and then 5-6 days later, they just throw up their hands and they're like, I can't do it. It's too hard. And I'm like, I tried to tell you, but you had to understand that, So Steve, you're a competitor. You've lived the competition life, and maybe you're the best one to help me and to kind of help us. How did you manage that transition, from being or was it something you didn't even have to? You just kind of intuitively just were able to do it?
Transitioning from
the meticulous to being less loose, but still being, effective and moving forward in what it was you were trying to accomplish big picture.
I think a lot of it was the timing. So I was in the headspace where I was burned out and I wasn't going to be able to I didn't want to do the other thing anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I had to find another way because the bridge was crumbling. So that was part of it. It was like the timing in my life was right for it. Yeah, basically. And then I had tracked for so long that I did have a good understanding of like the little details, like what's in food and that kind of stuff. And so it was kind of the combination of like being burned out, understanding a lot about food and all that stuff, and then just being willing to backslide, I guess. Mm-hmm. Being willing, like, I was like, I can't live like this anymore, and I'm willing to lose progress if it means I can gain a little more freedom. And I think that was part of it. I think for the longest time, I might not have wanted to try certain stuff, because I used to track year-round and reverse diet and all that different stuff, but like, I wasn't willing to go through a phase where I could not make progress or I could lose progress. Like, well, I wasn't open to that. And it wasn't until I was like accepting of like, I might actually regress here, or I might actually plateau, that I was willing to like test out different stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started kind of this system that like I teach people now, is like having them have some sort of structure in place and then just kind of lean into that structure and like slowly zoom out from tracking the meticulous and all that kind of stuff.
What that just made me think of is something that I pretty much preach to everybody that I work with, is we're almost giving them these powerful weapons and these tools. Like when someone is hyper-focused, competitive season, they're tracking everything like they have to, and then the season ends. Throughout that process, so if we rewind, if it's someone dealing with pain, on day one, we come up with all different modifications. We come up with, all right, try these 3 exercises before you train. And then when you're home, try to, open your refrigerator door with your other hand. And then also don't forget, like, try to sleep on the other side. And then also don't forget when you wash your hair, use your other arm to grab the shampoo or something like that. As we describe all those things after an evaluation, I make sure that I say, but this is only as needed. It's only in the short term. You're not going to be doing these things for the rest of your life. You're not going to be consciously aware, what arm am I grabbing the refrigerator door with for the rest of your life? These are tools that I'm showing you just for now. And then as this pain desensitizes and we progress from here, you're going to back off from these things. But the important thing is that you remember the tools that we went through when we had to, so that if it comes back, at least you have some tools in your toolbox to throw at it. And I think it's very similar to competitive bodybuilding. We go through that process and we get so meticulous and we count every macro and step count and everything is so sharp and crisp, and then it's just gone. And we have to transition back to the real world. And I think throughout the prep, I think it's important to keep reminding the competitor, these are powerful tools for a certain job. And when that job is over, set them aside. At least you have them. If you find that in the off season things are getting a little bit out of hand, you have these tools to maybe bring back as needed. But I think, especially if someone's doing it for the first time, I think it's important to keep reiterating, look, this is a very specific tool for a very specific job. This is not something long-term. We're going to use these tools as needed, and then we're eventually going to set them aside, and you can, access them as needed. I think that's really important in pain and rehab and competitive physique sport.
And I think that's why, like, my favorite analogy is what Jeff uses about the dimmer switch, being like, you can turn the intensity up or back the intensity off. So like I share that with clients all the time, is like getting away from the light switch mindset and more of like kind of like know what outcomes you're after. Like, you want to lose a pound a week. If that's the outcome, study your details. And if that's not happening, maybe turn up the dimmer switch a little bit. And if it is happening, either keep it the same or maybe back off a little bit. So I do like that visual.
Yeah. I love that and use that all the time too. The hard part is acquiring those tools. When we're talking about the general population client that is either A, converting to going to be a competition prep athlete, or acquiring those skills just so they can be more effective in whatever it is that they want. You know what I mean? And it's really hard to be patient acquiring those tools. You know what I mean? And sometimes you just start with one thing. It's kind of like, okay, I want you to just track your protein. That's it. I don't want you doing anything else. Sometimes I don't even want a daily total. I just want you hitting 40 grams of protein with each meal. That's acquiring that tool. And then you can use it and set it aside when you need it. On the training front. Okay, so you want to improve your delts. I want this setup so that we get 15 sets of delts working in this way and this way, this, and then the rest of it just kind of let it flow. And then we have that skill. We know, we can kind of do this. You know what I mean? But really, I don't even really know where I want to go with this. But I ultimately what I'm after is I want to help people understand that there's kind of a time and a place for everything. And just like me, I do not like doing unilateral work. I'm just going to have to suck it up and do it. If I want what it is that I want to achieve my goal, I'm going to have to suck it up and do it, and that's ultimately what I want, and you guys too, kind of give your feedback. It's like, okay, we got these tools, we know what we need to do, but when is the right time to do that? How do I, how am I effective in communicating that,
I've been thinking about this while you guys have been talking. I have to remind myself, and Brad, you probably do too, like when I was introduced to a more, evidence-based approach, it was coming from a place where I was doing things pretty inefficiently. And so going from, a meal plan and something that I had managed to get myself into the habits of doing, and then going to something like tracking or, a more not training to failure every set. Like these were easy changes for me to make. I remember like the first time I transitioned to like a more, macro based approach, it was more liberating than it was difficult.
I remember that too. Yeah.
And I think that that's not necessarily the case for a lot of people coming in now, because I think they're just, they've been exposed to it already through social media or whatever. So I have to remind myself of that. Like, they're coming from a different place. Like how do you want to meet them where they're at, and what steps do you want to take to get them to this point which acutely seems very daunting for that individual.
That's a great point, Brian, because it's like, depends on our past experience, what's difficult and what's not.
Yeah. For me, it was like, this is like autopilot now,
Yeah.
And it got to the point where it's like, okay, like this is easy, but it's not something I should need to be doing in the off season. It's like, and that's one thing with, I think we're kind of using nutrition here quite a bit. But reminding people that, the guidelines that we provide, it's not the guidelines themselves that are causing the progress. It's like just the cumulative structure that it's providing that's driving this progress. And I think that helps kind of avoid that on-off mentality where someone is, okay, well, I went over my macros by 5 grams, and then everything starts to kind of snowball from there. Getting them to understand this is just a rough structure to kind of steer the ship in the right direction, but there's leeway, there's a buffer there, either way. And so I think that's an important reminder when you're introducing people to a more structured approach like that, is like this. What's going to dictate your results isn't necessarily whether or not you're hitting these things down to the gram. It's where, like, are we steering the ship where we want to go? Are we building the structure and, pushing that in the direction that we want to go? And because I do think that it's not rare, and you've probably seen this, Steve, like to have people that they sort of miss the overall big picture when they think like, getting to this, like the precision itself is what's driving the progress, not the environment that the precision's providing, which can still be achieved without a militant mindset. So
I want to write that down. That's good.
Yeah, because I've been like on that, like I've been organizing like this conversation in my head, and I think that's like a great way to transition to like what is, but like the things I've been talking about have been like, basically be aware of, content and trying to find good sources to consume content from. And then we've kind of gone over like focusing on the long term and knowing, based on where somebody's at, how focused they need to be or how not focused they need to be. And so maybe we could shift into like the practical side of stuff of maybe like, what are those things that, like we're saying, hey, don't get lost in the weeds, don't get lost in the nuances. What are those big things that everyone should be focusing on? Because really, like for people who don't compete and those who do compete, off season, the big things are the same. It's only when somebody is actually like getting close to like the low end of their body fat is like when they need to start cranking things up. So really the two overlap at the beginning, and then it's like the competitor, as they get leaner, then starts to have to get a little more nuanced. So maybe we could start with what are the big things that everyone should focus on, and then from there, at what point, or what are those little things that once somebody's already lean, that they could then kind of fine tune when they need to.
I think just I'll start with the pain side of it first, just because it's going to be pretty quick. When from day one, first we usually educate what pain is, what pain isn't, and then rule out red flags. If there are red flags, refer to the appropriate provider. If there are no red flags, then we just go down the trail of regression, modification, keep the patient's goals in mind, and then that's when it gets individual and we can kind of go different routes. But practically that is what happens with everyone. It's just rolling out red flags, educating what pain is and what pain isn't, so that it prevents the kind of the hyper focus like we're talking about on I think it's this muscle that's hurting me. It's probably not one structure that's causing your pain, and then kind of so education is key, and then ruling out red flags, and then we kind of just go from there.
Well, and on the client side, that your patient, our clients, etc. I really try to tout, don't be perfect. Don't even strive to be perfect, because even in my competitors, my competition prep athletes that are like going to be doing a show in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, I don't want you perfect. I don't want to see 42, 60, 200, 40, 60, 200, 40, 60, 200, 40. I don't want to see that, but I want you to be excellent, And so if it is the competitor, we've got these calories, we've got these macros, we've got these totals for the week. I want you consistently hitting an average. I want you consistently hitting the totals for the week, And then on the flip side, if it's off-season competitor, gym pop, kind of in between there, I don't want you to be perfect there either, I want you tracking your protein, a few meals a week to making sure that you've kind of got a little audit there, If it's your training, we've got this microcycle. get it done before you go to the next one. Don't let it take 14 days, but you don't necessarily have to get it done in 6 or 7 days. If it's your PT, your prehab, whatever, don't feel like you have to sit down and do a 60-minute stretching session. Do several sessions for a few seconds every day. And a lot of times I'll leave it kind of loose like that. I'll say several, not 4, not 10, several, and just leave it at that. And sometimes people will give a little bit of pushback. They want to know, well, how many times should I be doing that? And how many sets should I be hitting? There's a little bit of pushback there because they want me to tell them a definitive number, but I just want excellence over time. I want you consistently executing this plan. And that's what's going to get us the result that we're after on both sides. We don't have to be perfect, but we got to be good, with our, because I still really, the only time I get frustrated is when I say, okay, well, you know what? I want you to make sure that you're hitting, certain grams of protein on average, and then 3-4 check-ins later, it was like down the list of their check-in, and they talked about it last, and then pretty soon they're not talking about it. And then they're complaining about recovery or their body composition. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. What was your protein intake at? I kind of forgot about that. That's the only time that I really kind of get frustrated is I just want good execution, whether it's tight and meticulous and we're trying to hit very close specific targets or just establishing habits,
So you had mentioned like initial things to focus on. I think, like Brad said, I think calories, like one thing I'll kind of do is say I have an athlete in the off season that knows how to track, but they don't necessarily need to be having assigned numbers, for where they're at. I might give them, and I'll honestly do this in prep too sometimes, is, like I'll give a caloric range, like 2,400 to 2,600, and then a protein range, and then like a fat minimum. And then they can kind of teach them to sort of auto-regulate, and tell them like, okay, regardless of where you fall in this range, like it's going to average out probably somewhere in the middle by the end of the week, but regardless of where we fall in this range, we are, one step closer towards the direction that we want to be going. We're still taking forward strides. You're able to, sort of be flexible with the approach with, okay, how's my perceived recovery? How's my hunger? Are there social events that I need to have a little bit more of a buffer for? But I think one thing, when people transition to prep is they initially anyway, they sort of assume those same principles they no longer apply, okay, there's like now things need to be rigid. And I think there's still a dimmer switch that's occurring across a contest prep. And I think that's something that's often overlooked is, someone will go from not tracking or just tracking protein and calories to, okay, I'm at 42 fat, 163 carb. And it's like, okay, this is one, not necessary. And two, like it's just such a radical shift in behavior that it can be setting themselves, you can be setting them up for failure doing that. So, and I know something like Berto and I have talked about in the past is, having, I think with especially natural bodybuilding, with the lengths of some of these preps, it's the people that are able to sort of conserve energy, that aren't coming out of the gates like swinging, and they, 15 weeks in, they're just smoked and burned out. Like implementing structure or additional structure and parameters as needed, rather than like assuming they're required out of the gate, and being able to kind of conserve that additional energy for when you actually need it. Because, initially it's like you can still get away with those ranges, maybe shift them just more towards the deficit side of things, push yourself towards the goals. And I mean, you look at someone like Alberto, I mean, he's gotten to the point where now he's able to kind of stay pretty flexible all the way up until a show. And that takes experience. Like you can't expect, like people tend to become more neurotic as his prep goes on. And I think it's normal for people to like telling them, okay, well, you don't, like, I need you to be more flexible. Like that can create more problems than it's worth. Yeah. So, allowing that natural, attention to detail be like work for them rather than against them in some cases, I think is good at those stages, and just picking your spots of when you'll actually benefit from like more granular approaches.
All right, so fellas, how do we want to wrap this up? Do we want to put a little bow on it? Be like water? Use your tools?
Yeah, I think it's a good conversation. I think that it's important for the client and the provider, coach, clinician to meet the person where they're at, and know that we have to approach them differently, but the principles are pretty much the same, but we just have to kind of shift and a bit depending on who's in front of us. And I think it's interesting how many parallels there are from coaching, nutrition, and physical therapy. And Brian, like you were saying before, some other fields, like if you watch a wildlife documentary and you go tell someone like, do you know that these frogs like jump like 30 feet? And then if there's like some person who's an expert on frogs, they're like, they don't do that. Or it's something just...
It's like me telling my mom, like, you watched Game Changers, didn't you?
So yeah, I think these principles, I think the viewer, whatever your day-to-day job, occupation, hobby is, maybe you're in service of people, I think you could probably take what we're talking about and implement it possibly into what it is that you do. So I think this conversation kind of transcends more than bodybuilding and pain. So I think that's kind of cool whenever those things happen.
I like it.
I think my final thoughts are, like, when I think about just the conversations as a whole, it was more about the overall kind of approach and I don't know, the big themes to all of this. So I think in the show notes for this episode, we'll put links for the specifics of things that people can focus on if they're like, this is more of like, hey, like the overall, like, maybe don't do this or don't do that, or be careful of this, be careful of that. But there wasn't a ton on the like, okay, let's do this, and that. And I think that's because we've covered that in so many episodes before that we didn't want to go down the same trails. So I think what we'll do is we'll just link those episodes for the people who are like in a place where like, okay, here's what I don't do, but what should I do? And so those will be in the show notes of this episode.
Well, I think too, it's going to be important to know where you're at. Where are you at in your spectrum of off-season, general population, competition prep? Know where you're at. Maybe pull in a few extra brains to know where it is that you're truly at and what it is that you need to start doing, utilizing these tools, and what are the important parts of what we just talked about that applies to you. First, you got to know where you're at, kind of in your journey. So, all right, gents. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you, 3DMJers, and until next time.
What's going on, 3DMJers? Eric Helms here. Thanks for listening to our podcast. I just want to take a second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I put out with Greg Nuckols, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Dr. Eric Trexler. We cover the most up-to-date, peer-reviewed research in the world of strength and physique sport that's directly relevant to your practice as a coach or athlete. We provide our reviews in written format, but also, since you enjoy our podcast, audio roundtable reviews where we discuss the research in depth. Finally, we also do video concept reviews where we cover a broader topic in video format for your learning. For fitness professionals, you can take quizzes on MASS content and earn continuing education credits in most of the biggest certifying bodies in the fitness industry. If you want to sign up and get a subscription, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com and click on the Products tab. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.